This year, the Supreme Court handed down several historic rulings, including one related to school prayer. But what effect will that have on the upcoming year? Joining us this morning to discuss prayer in school and the separation of church and state is Chalkbeat reporter Matt Barnum, a nonprofit news organization that covers education issues in America. Matt, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump in here. In June, the Supreme Court sided with a former high school football coach who prayed at the 50-yard line after games. Can you tell us more about what the court's thought process was on this decision?
Yeah, the court was saying, look, this was a personal private prayer. He wasn't acting as a coach. He was making his own personal religious expression at the end of the game where coaches have a lot of free time. So you can't limit a school district, the government can't limit someone's personal expression, at least not completely. They saw it as a religious freedom violation. And that was for the conservative majority on the court. Now, I should say the progressives, the three progressives dissented and sort of scoffed. Sonia Sotomayor scoffed at the idea this was a private prayer. She said, look, this was at the 50-yard line and players often join the coach. This was anything but private. But the majority said, yeah, this was a personal private prayer, and that's allowed by school employees.
So they're saying this was a personal private prayer. Does this mean that educators will be able to openly pray in class?
Well, it depends, right? So there was a 1962 Supreme Court decision that said, no, schools and teachers cannot start the day with a prayer, an official school prayer. And the court didn't overturn that. They didn't even mention that decision. So that's still good law. That's still not allowed. But they did give an example of, let's say a teacher is in class during lunch hour, and maybe there are a couple students who are also in class. The court said, well, of course, the teacher can just bow their head and pray. You know, that's a private prayer, and it would be absurd for the school to say that a teacher couldn't do it. But I think there are going to be some gray areas. Like, let's say during lunch, the teacher bows her head to pray, and then the next day, a couple students say they want to join in that prayer. Is that a private prayer, or is that a public school sanctioned prayer? I don't think that's clear.
You mentioned these gray areas. So overall, what does this mean for the separation of church and state?
Well, it still exists, but what's clear is that this Supreme Court has de-emphasized that or interpreted it in a different way than prior courts. And they've placed a lot more emphasis on religious freedom and saying, we don't think it's right for the government to try to stop religious expression. And that tends to win the day over claims of separation of church and state.
I want to move on here. Last spring, a school district in Pennsylvania denied the ability to form an after-school Satan club in northern York. Does this open the window for all religions?
The short answer is yes. You know, this is about religious expression of religions of all sorts. This is not limited to any particular religion, Christian or otherwise. And the court specifically gives an example of it would be unconstitutional to say that a Muslim teacher couldn't wear a headscarf. Now, there are like tricky questions of like, what is a bona fide religion? How do you distinguish between a real religion and something that isn't a religion? But yes, absolutely, this would apply to religious expression of all sorts.
So what happens next? What does this ruling mean down the road for other cases involving religion and schools?
Well, I think what's interesting is what this means. It means more for a lot of instances that will never reach the Supreme Court, much less any sort of court. What happens next is that school districts will have to implement this decision. And there isn't like a frequently asked questions that the Supreme Court hands down to make clear exactly how it applies. And there's a lot of ambiguity. So school officials are going to have to decide where to draw the line, and they might face litigation. In many cases, they won't, though, and they'll just have to go off the Supreme Court's ruling. And I think that's what's really tricky here. It's just not totally clear what it means in all these sorts of gray areas, and officials are just going to have to make a call, and it's often going to be a tough call.
Matt Barnum, thank you so much, reporter with Chalkbeat, for breaking it down this morning. We certainly appreciate your insight on the issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.